That morning, when the crows were circling over the ridge, Ben had no idea his old black lab Daisy, who had just lost every one of her puppies, was about to have her heart torn open a second time. Down in a crack of rock, 4 half-frozen bobcat kittens were crying for a mother who would never come, and within a few hours they would be tucked into the same wooden box where Daisy still searched for her own. From the moment she chose to lick those wild little bodies clean, to the day she chased the truck that carried them away and collapsed in the road, one question hung over the Blue Ridge. If your family truly belonged to the wild, would you love them enough to let them go? The morning the crows began circling over the ridge, Ben Walker was already awake. At 62, his body never slept all the way through anymore. Old knees, old scars, old memories. Something always nudged him out of bed before the sun. He pulled on the same faded flannel shirt, poured himself a cup of coffee that had been waiting on the timer, and stepped out onto the back porch of his small apple orchard tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Daisy lifted her head when the screen door creaked. The black Labrador lay beside an old wooden whelping box pushed into the corner of the porch, as if she were still guarding what was no longer there. Ben's heart pinched at the sight of her nose resting on the rim, the way her dark eyes searched the empty box every morning like she might have missed one of her puppies hiding in the blankets. "Morning, girl," he said softly. "Ain't nothing in there but old quilts." She thumped her tail once, polite, and then looked back at the box. It had been months since that night at the emergency clinic, since the vet had squeezed his shoulder and murmured something about complications, and we did all we could. The bill had been more than he liked to think about. Veterinary care wasn't cheap, even with the little pet insurance rider tacked onto his homeowner's policy, but the money hadn't been the part that hurt. It was the way Daisy had searched every room for days, whimpering, sleeping with her head inside that empty box until her fur was damp with her own tears. Now she rarely barked. She just watched. Watched the driveway, watched the tree line, watched that box. Ben understood. His own house felt that way since his wife had passed, full of furniture, short on life. The only reason the place still worked at all was the routine: pruning trees, checking the irrigation, making sure the old farmhouse and the rickety barn stayed just sound enough to pass an inspection and keep his modest retirement savings from evaporating into repairs. He took a sip of coffee and frowned. Above the far slope, where the gravel service road cut across the hill behind the orchard, a tight circle of crows wheeled in the pale sky. Their voices were sharp and urgent, not the lazy chatter he heard when they were just arguing over corn husks in the field. "That's no good," he muttered. He set the mug down and whistled softly. Daisy's ears pricked, but she didn't move from the box. "You stay," he told her. "I'll be right back." He grabbed his jacket and the small walking stick he used more as a balance pole than a weapon, then headed up the narrow path between rows of bare apple trees. Frost clung to the fallen leaves, crunching under his boots. The air had that thin, metallic bite it got in late fall, the kind that made him think about furnace checks and the old home security system his wife had insisted on, the one that now mostly nagged him if he forgot to lock the back door. As he climbed, the crows grew louder. They were circling over a bend in the service road where the forest pressed close, and sunlight only reached the ground for an hour or two a day. Ben's breath fogged in front of him as he stepped onto the gravel. He saw the blood first, a dark smear across the pale stones, already drying at the edges. Then he saw her. The bobcat lay half in the ditch, half on the road, one foreleg twisted at an angle that didn't belong to the living. She was beautiful, even in death, tawny fur flecked with spots, belly gone still. Ben took off his cap and stood there a moment, feeling the old, familiar ache that came whenever he stumbled across roadkill up here. Folks drove too fast on these back roads, especially the ones hauling timber or rushing deliveries that made their way across the mountains. "Sorry, girl," he said under his breath. "You never stood a chance against a pickup." The crows screamed from the branches overhead, impatient. They hopped from limb to limb, waiting for him to move on so they could finish what nature had started. Ben was turning to go when he heard it. A sound like a rusty hinge, thin and cracked, and almost too faint to hear over the crows. Then another, a small, desperate mew that didn't match the body at his feet. He froze, listening. The sound came again from somewhere down in the tangle of briars and rocks below the road. He dropped to one knee, easing his way toward the edge, and parted the brush with his stick. At first he saw only shadows and dead leaves. Then a pair of eyes flashed green-blue in the dimness. Then another. 4 tiny shapes huddled in a shallow hollow beneath an overhanging rock, jammed together so tightly they looked like one trembling bundle of fur. Bobcat kittens, so small their ears still seemed too big for their heads, their whiskers slicked with dried milk, their thin sides fluttering with each breath. One of them tried to hiss at him, but it came out as a broken squeak. The smell hit him then, sour milk, cold stone, fear, and the metallic tang of death from the road above. These little ones had been waiting for a mother who wasn't coming back. "Lord help us," Ben whispered. One kitten stumbled sideways, claws scrabbling at the rock. Its legs didn't seem to know which direction to go. Another pawed at its sibling's ear, too weak even to start a proper fight. Up the hill, on the opposite slope, movement caught his eye. A lean coyote stood at the tree line, head low, ears pricked toward the sound. It lifted its nose, sniffed the air, and took a step closer. Ben's grip tightened on the stick. He knew how this would go if he walked away. The crows would come down first, then the coyote, and by nightfall there would be nothing left in that hollow but a few tufts of fur. It was the way of the wild, clean and merciless. He also knew the law. You weren't supposed to scoop up wildlife and take it home like strays. There were numbers you were meant to call, forms to fill out, people with training and funding, and a whole network of grants and animal rescue organizations behind them. He thought of the brochure Maya from the Wildlife Center had once left at the farmer's market, all about proper procedures and emergency contacts. But it was early, and the nearest center was more than 2 hours' drive. By the time anyone got up here, the crows and the coyote would have long since finished their work. One of the kittens tried to climb its way up the rock toward him and slipped, landing in a sprawl on its side. The effort left it panting, mouth open, tiny tongue showing. Ben felt something inside his chest twist the same way Daisy's body had curled around that empty, whelping box. He saw her lying on the porch, staring at nothing, and he saw these 4 little lives staring at nothing but sky and scavengers. "Well," he said softly, more to himself than to them, "maybe we all get one foolish decision left in us." He went back up to the road, fetched an old wooden apple crate from the back of his pickup, and lined it with his jacket. Then he knelt in the briars and one by one gently scooped the bobcat kittens from their hollow. They were all bones and fur and trembling, but they clung to the warmth of his hands instead of fighting him. Even the little one that had tried to hiss only pressed its tiny claws into his sleeve and held on. He set them into the crate, tucking the jacket around them, and they burrowed into it, tiny bodies pressing together for whatever comfort they could find. The crows shrieked in protest from above as he lifted the crate into the truck bed. The coyote watched a moment longer, then turned and slipped back into the trees. Opportunity lost. Ben stood there with his hand on the side of the crate, feeling the faint vibrations of their mews under the wood. He knew he was walking straight into a mess of paperwork, worry, and possible fines. He also knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that leaving them wasn't an option he could live with. "Hang on, little wild things," he murmured as he climbed into the driver's seat. "We'll figure this out together." He started the engine and turned the truck toward home, unaware that down the hill Daisy had left the empty whelping box for the first time that morning and was standing at the edge of the porch, nose lifted, as if she already smelled the change coming on the cold mountain air. By the time Ben's pickup rumbled back into the yard, the sun had climbed over the ridge and laid a soft gold light across the old farmhouse. Daisy was right where he'd left her, stretched beside the empty whelping box, her black coat shining in the cold morning light. At the sound of the truck, her head came up, ears pricked, tail giving a hopeful thump. For months now, any unusual sound in the driveway had been a disappointment. No one came much anymore. Ben eased the truck to a stop and killed the engine. For a moment he just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, feeling the faint scratching and shifting coming from the wooden crate in the back. He thought about his retirement savings, about the cost of another vet visit, about how the last emergency bill had gone straight onto a credit card he was still paying down. Then he thought about those 4 small faces under the rock and decided some things were worth a dent in his online banking balance. "Easy, girl," he called as he stepped out. "I've brought company." Daisy trotted off the porch, not quite as bouncy as she'd been in her younger days, but still eager enough. Then she smelled the crate. Her body stiffened, nose working the air, eyes sharp. Ben lowered the crate onto the porch and lifted the lid an inch. 4 sets of eyes blinked against the light. One of the kittens let out a hoarse, complaining cry. Daisy leaned in, nostrils flaring, tail held low and uncertain. "Hold on now," Ben murmured. "These aren't for chasing." He carried the crate past her and into the old storage room off the barn, the one that still smelled faintly of hay and motor oil and the cedar chips he used when the whelping box had been full of life. He'd converted one corner into a kind of improvised clinic over the years, a place for first aid kits and flea treatments, dog food, and the basket where he kept the paperwork for Daisy's health insurance and vaccination records. All of it seemed very small and tame compared to what he was about to attempt. He set the crate on a workbench, found a worn blanket, and then dug into the cupboard where his late wife had kept everything labeled. There it was, an old canister of kitten formula, unopened, just in case one of the barn cats ever needed it. She'd always said it was cheaper than another emergency call and better than wondering if you should have done more. "Guess we're about to find out," he said under his breath. He followed the directions on the label, mixing warm water from the tap until the powder turned into a thin, milky liquid. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and one of the little bottles sloshed over, but soon he had 4 tiny feeders lined up like soldiers, ready for duty. It felt strange to realize that the same kind of careful attention he used when comparing car insurance rates or figuring out the best deal on heating oil was now being poured into getting the exact temperature right for a wild animal's breakfast. One by one, he lifted the kittens from the crate. They were all claws and trembling bones, lighter than the apples he sorted every fall. The first one turned its head away from the rubber nipple, too shocked or stubborn to cooperate, but hunger finally won. Tiny jaws latched on and began to suck, weakly at first, then with more determination. Daisy hovered at the doorway, toenails ticking on the concrete, eyes never leaving his hands. Her ears flicked forward with each squeak, each little swallow. "It's okay, girl," Ben said. "They're just passing through. We'll get 'em to someone who knows what they're doing." He fed the second and third kitten, wiping spilled milk from their whiskers with the corner of his sleeve. The fourth, smallest of the bunch, with a narrow face and a scrap of white under the chin, made a raspy attempt at a hiss, batting at his fingers with a paw no bigger than a coin. "Well now," he murmured, "you're a fighter." The paw didn't even scratch. The tiny body trembled, then sagged against his palm, finally accepting the bottle. It took longer than he'd expected. His back began to ache from leaning over, and by the time all four bellies felt a little rounder, his coffee had gone cold, and the mountain light had shifted on the floorboards. He set them back into the crate and pulled the blanket up around their shoulders. Four little heads sank down, eyes sliding shut. He straightened up slowly, rubbing his neck. Daisy edged closer, taking advantage of the small gap he'd left in the doorway. "All right," he warned gently. "You can look, but no scaring 'em." She moved like a dog who'd walked these floors 1,000 times, but there was a hesitancy in her step he hadn't seen before, as if she were approaching a room where something fragile was kept. She rested her front paws on the lower shelf of the workbench and stretched her neck toward the crate. The kittens smelled her before they saw her. One stirred, nose twitching. Another cracked an eye, then another. The little fighter with the white chin lifted its head and with a threadbare effort opened its mouth in a quiet hiss, a sound that said, as clearly as if it were human, "You're not my mother." Daisy flinched back an inch, surprised. She looked over at Ben, and for just a second he could have sworn he saw confusion in her eyes, maybe even hurt. "Easy," he said softly. "They don't know you yet." He closed the crate and ushered her out, promising himself he'd build something sturdier, a proper cage, maybe with help from the local hardware store, once he'd figured out how to squeeze another purchase into his budget. For now, the crate and a nearby space heater would have to do. The day passed in a blur of small tasks, mixing more formula, checking on the orchard, returning a voicemail from the wildlife center, and leaving a detailed message for Maya about what he'd found. He mentioned the approximate age of the kittens, their weight, the condition of the mother. He did not mention Daisy, not yet. There would be time enough for explanations when somebody with a clipboard came up the hill. By late evening, the house had settled into its familiar creaks. The old furnace kicked on with a low hum, another reminder of the monthly bills that always seemed to arrive faster than the pension check. Ben set an alarm on his phone for the next feeding, pulled on a second sweater, and went back out to the storage room. He found Daisy there ahead of him. At some point during the last hour, she'd nudged the door open with her nose and slipped inside. Now she lay on the concrete floor, front half of her body stretched toward the workbench. She had managed to wedge her shoulders and head under the lowest shelf, just enough to press her chest against the side of the crate. Inside, all four bobcat kittens had abandoned their corners and drifted toward the warmth. Two of them were asleep with their backs against the wooden slats. The third had a paw resting where Daisy's heartbeat thumped slow and steady. The little fighter with the white chin had its nose jammed into the crack, as close to her as it could get. Breathing in that big dog smell that meant heat and heart, and something like safety. Daisy was not asleep. Her eyes were open, soft and dark, watching them. Every so often she lifted her head just enough to lick the edge of the crate, as if trying to groom them through the wood. Ben stood in the doorway, the bottle of warm formula cooling in his hand, and felt the quiet in the room settle around him like a blanket. For the first time in a long while, the emptiness that had echoed through the old farmhouse didn't feel quite so loud. "Well, girl," he whispered, barely daring to break the spell, "looks like you've found yourself another job." Daisy's tail moved once, a small, careful thump against the floor, as if she were afraid of disturbing the tiny wild hearts pressed against her side. Within a week, the little storage room off the barn didn't feel like a storage room anymore. It felt like a nursery that had been stitched out of whatever scraps life had left lying around. An old apple crate, a second-hand space heater, a stack of towels that had once been good guest linens. Daisy had moved from the porch to that doorway as if someone had reassigned her, and she'd taken the promotion to heart. The bobcat kittens grew faster than Ben expected. Their legs filled out, their eyes sharpened, and their voices changed from weak mews to little rusty chirps that echoed against the concrete. They wrestled in the crate, batting and tumbling, giving Daisy worried looks only when one of them took a spill too hard. Then her big black head would lower and she'd nudge them back into a warm pile, licking a stray ear as if she'd never lost the habit. Sometimes, when he came in for the night feeding, Ben would find one of them asleep, with its nose pressed through the slats into Daisy's chest, feeling her heartbeat the way Daisy had once listened for her puppies. Mrs. Cole started coming over more often, always with some excuse. One day, it was a pan of cornbread. Another day, it was a jar of pickles she couldn't finish by herself. Truth was, the old widow had been as lonely as Ben, and this strange little family gave her something new to hover over. She'd stand in the doorway in her cardigan, hands folded, watching Daisy and the kittens with a soft, faraway smile that reminded Ben of church on Easter Sunday. "You can't keep calling them, 'Hey, you,' and that one, you know?" She scolded gently one afternoon as they both watched the chaos in the crate. "Everything alive needs a proper name." Ben scratched the back of his neck. "Didn't think I ought to name something that's heading back to the wild." "You named Daisy," she said. "Didn't stop her from being a dog." So they started trying names on like hats. The boldest kitten, the one who always clawed its way to the highest corner of the crate or tried to scale his pant leg, became Ridge after the high line of mountains that watched over the orchard. The fiery one with the reddish coat and quick temper turned into Ember, the prickly, suspicious kitten who hated to be picked up, all claws and complaints, got saddled with Thorn. And the smallest, with the narrow face and white spot under the chin, the one who still melted into Daisy's fur whenever the world seemed too big, became Clover. For a bit of luck, Mrs. Cole said. Ben didn't write the names down anywhere formal, not in the same neat folder where he kept Daisy's pet insurance papers and vet receipts and all the ordinary responsibilities of a domestic life. But the names stuck just the same. Before long, if Ember yowled, Daisy would look up, recognizing the tone. When Clover cried, Daisy was there before Ben could even set his coffee down. It was Mrs. Cole who brought Tyler. "You need a young back to haul that feed," she said, but Ben noticed the way her eyes danced when she mentioned her grandson's new phone, the one that takes moving pictures better than my old television. Tyler was 13, all elbows and sneakers, with hair that wouldn't stay flat, and a grin that came easy. He'd grown up on Wi-Fi and search engines, on videos of cute puppies and people comparing credit card rewards and bargain hunting like it was a sport. The moment he stepped into the storage room and saw Daisy sprawled on her side with 4 wild bobcats stacked along her belly like oddly spotted puppies, his jaw dropped. "Grandma," he breathed, "this is insane." "Language," Mrs. Cole said, but she was smiling. Without really asking, Tyler pulled out his phone and started recording. Daisy lifted her head, then settled again when she realized it was just another human. Ridge pounced on Ember's tail, Ember spun and tackled Thorn, and Clover climbed Daisy's shoulder, slipping and scrambling until Daisy gently lowered him back down with a nudge of her nose. "People are not going to believe this," Tyler whispered. She's like a foster mom." Ben shifted his weight, uneasy. "Now, son, this isn't a circus act. They're going back to the rescue folks as soon as we can manage it." I know," Tyler said, but his thumbs were already moving, trimming the clip, adding a simple caption. "My grandma's neighbor's lab adopted wild bobcats. No joke." He didn't add a location, didn't add a name, just a little heart and a paw print. Then, with the casualness of someone checking mortgage rates or weather forecasts, he tapped post and slid the phone back into his pocket. They spent the rest of the afternoon helping Ben nail extra wire onto the outdoor pen he'd started assembling so the kittens could have some fresh air when the weather allowed. Daisy supervised from the shade, occasionally sticking her nose through the gaps to bump Clover or Ridge as they explored. When the work was done and the light began to fade, Mrs. Cole and Tyler headed home, promising to bring over a bag of extra towels in the morning. It wasn't until later, after the evening feeding, after Daisy had settled with her chin on the edge of the crate and the kittens were a jumbled heap of spots and tails, that Ben's phone buzzed on the kitchen table. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and picked it up, expecting another email about utility bills or some reminder from his online banking app. Instead, he saw a stream of messages from Tyler. "Mr. Walker, that video blew up. Like really blew up. There's thousands of views already. People are asking if it's real." Ben clicked the link Tyler sent. There, on the small screen, was his storage room, his black lab, his 4 wild boarders. The little clip looped over and over, Daisy licking Clover's ear, Ridge swatting at a bottle, Ember and Thorn tumbling across her paws. Underneath, comments stacked up faster than he could read them. Faith in humanity restored. "I didn't know I needed this today. Is this legal? Someone tag a wildlife rescue, please." He felt his throat tighten. The world had found them. A story that had lived quiet on his hill, meant only for a few tired hearts, was suddenly sitting on strangers' phones next to ads for health insurance and vacation packages. He glanced through the doorway toward the barn where Daisy and the Bobcats slept, unaware that something invisible had just crossed the boundary between wild and home in a way none of them could see. "Easy now," he murmured to the empty kitchen, as much to himself as to them. "We were just trying to make it through the week." He set the phone down, but the numbers kept climbing, little hearts ticking upward like a timer he hadn't agreed to start. Somewhere, far from the quiet ridge and the soft breathing in the storage room, the rest of the world was pulling up a chair to watch. The first real scare came on a clear afternoon that looked harmless enough to belong on a postcard. The air over the orchard was crisp and bright, the kind of Blue Ridge day that made the trees look closer than they really were. Ben had moved the bobcat kittens and Daisy into the new outdoor pen he'd cobbled together behind the barn, a rectangle of heavy wire, roofed over with extra fencing and tarps, anchored into the ground with stakes he'd found on sale at the farm supply store. He told himself the pen would give them fresh air and sunshine, help their bones grow strong, and give Daisy a break from the 4 sets of paws climbing over her on the cement floor. The truth was, he also felt better seeing them under that patch of blue sky, like the wild might not feel quite so cramped if it had a view. He was bent over a cracked PVC pipe a few yards away, wrestling with a stubborn leak in the irrigation line. The numbers from Tyler's video were still ticking upward in the back of his mind. Millions of views now, thousands of comments. People from as far away as California and Canada arguing about whether what he'd done was a miracle or a crime. He'd never imagined his quiet hill would be mentioned in the same breath as viral clips and ad breaks for life insurance and credit card rewards. Daisy's bark cut through his thoughts. It wasn't her usual polite "someone's in the driveway" sound. This was sharp and raw, a noise that pulled his head up before he knew he had moved. He saw it almost at the same moment she did. A broad shadow swept across the pen, sliding over the gravel like a moving cloud. High above, wings spread wide, a bald eagle rode the wind, tilting and circling. Ben had watched them hunt the river more times than he could count, admired their power from a distance. He had never seen one come this close to the barn. The eagle folded its wings and dropped. Inside the pen, Ridge and Ember froze mid-wrestle. Thorn flattened himself against the back corner. Clover, curious and just slow enough to be dangerous, toddled toward the center of the pen, craning his neck to watch the shadow grow larger. "Daisy!" Ben yelled, already running. He didn't have to tell her. She exploded into motion, a streak of black muscle and fur. In 2 strides she was over Clover, planting herself between the kittens and the sky. Her body curved around them, head low, teeth bared, a growl rolling out of her chest, so deep it seemed to shake the wire. The eagle's talons raked the air just above the pen, catching the edge of the tarp with a sound like rick, ripping canvas. A strip of it tore loose and whipped away in the wind. Startled by Daisy's sudden, hawk-sized fury, the big bird flared its wings and veered off, climbing back into the bright, cold safety of its own element. Ben reached the pen a heartbeat later, breath burning in his chest. The kittens were pressed so tight against Daisy's belly they looked like they might disappear into her fur. She didn't move until the shadow had shrunk to a distant speck, then lifted her head and sniffed the air, every hair along her spine still standing. "You all right, girl?" Ben asked, voice shaking more than he liked. She glanced back at him, eyes wide and dark, then touched her nose to Clover's head as if counting them one by one. It was only then that Ben noticed the pickup parked down by the fence line. The county seal was stenciled on the door, the kind you saw on letterhead for property tax bills and those official-looking envelopes that made you think about home insurance and zoning fines. A man in a khaki jacket stood beside it, phone raised, recording. Even from a distance, Ben could see the set of the man's shoulders, stiff, professional, not a neighbor out for a drive. The man lowered the phone and started up the path. He was in his 40s, maybe, with close-cropped hair and a face that had forgotten how to smile for strangers. "Afternoon," he called. "You Ben Walker?" Ben forced his breathing to slow. "That's me. Name's Hank Miller, County Animal Control." He tapped the patch on his sleeve as if the title might carry extra weight. "You want to tell me why I just watched a bald eagle try to grab what looks like 4 illegal pets out of your backyard?" "They're not pets," Ben said quickly. "They're rescues, orphans. I called the Wildlife Center in Asheville the day I found them." Hank's gaze slid from Ben to Daisy and the kittens, still huddled in the corner of the pen. He took in the torn tarp, the makeshift fencing, the way Daisy planted herself between him and the young bobcats, chest heaving. "Rescues or not," Hank said, "North Carolina law's pretty clear about keeping wild predators on private property without a permit, especially with that kind of social media attention." "So you've seen the video," Ben said quietly. "Hard not to." Hank's mouth flattened. "My phone's been ringing off the hook. Folks emailing links, asking if we've lost our minds up here. You got people online talking about donating to you, others talking about calling a lawyer if somebody gets hurt." Ben felt his stomach knot. He'd thought about lawyers in the abstract, those ads that promised free consultations and accident claims. It all felt like another world, a world with courtrooms and office towers, not orchards and frost. "I'm not trying to break the law," he said. "I was just trying to keep them from dying under a rock." Hank studied him for a long moment, then let out a breath through his nose. "I believe you. But believing you and keeping you out of trouble are two different things." Before Ben could answer, the crunch of tires on gravel drew both their eyes. A second vehicle rolled into the yard, this one a dusty SUV, with the logo of the Appalachian Wildlife Rescue Center on the door. Maya Rivera stepped out, dark hair pulled back, clipboard in hand. "Ben," she called, "you picked one heck of a week to call me." Hank nodded to her. "You're Maya?" "That's right." She shook his hand. "You must be Animal Control." "That's me." They all walked up to the pen together. Maya stood very still, taking in the scene. Daisy, the 4 kittens, the torn tarp, the raw fear still lingering in the air. When Clover peeked out from under Daisy's chest, Maya's face softened. "Those are good weights," she murmured, more to herself. "Coats look healthy, eyes clear. You've done better than most amateurs, Ben." "I didn't mean to be an amateur," he said. "It just sort of happened." She glanced toward Hank. "And now it's on every screen from here to Denver, which means we need a plan that keeps the cat safe, keeps Mr. Walker out of court, and doesn't give the internet a reason to eat us alive." Hank folded his arms. "I'm listening." Maya spoke in the careful tone of someone used to explaining liability and public safety to nervous landowners who'd rather be fixing tractors than thinking about insurance and regulations. She laid out the facts. The kittens were old enough to move to the center's large outdoor enclosure soon, but they'd need a bit more time to finish their vaccinations and build up muscle. Daisy's involvement was unusual, touching even, but it complicated things. The longer the bobcat stayed, the more attached everyone would become, and the harder any separation would be, legally and emotionally. "So here's what I'm proposing," she said finally. "Ben keeps them here for a little longer, under our supervision. We'll formalize it, temporary wildlife custody. I come out twice a week, check their progress, adjust their diet. Hank gets documentation that this isn't some backyard zoo, and in 6 weeks, no later, they transfer to the center. No extensions." Hank frowned. 6 weeks is generous. "It's also realistic," Maya replied. "To rush them, and you risk them failing when it's time to go truly wild. Let them linger, and—" She looked at Daisy, who was still guarding the kittens with a devotion that needed no words. "Well, we saw what almost happened out of the sky today. The wild isn't going to wait for us to untangle our feelings." Ben felt Daisy press against his leg, as if she understood that all the talk had something to do with her family. He looked from Maya to Hank, then back to the pen where Ridge was starting to edge out from under his mother's shadow, testing the air again. 6 weeks, he said slowly, "and then they go with you." Maya nodded. "And in the meantime, we do this right, all right? No more surprises for animal control, no more unsupervised videos, no more pretending this is just a cute story on the internet." Hank pulled a form from his folder, the kind of official paper that made Ben think of mortgage documents and home insurance policies, things you signed when life was about to change, whether you liked it or not. "Sign here," Hank said, "and we'll all do our best to keep this from turning into a mess for you, for the county, and for those cats." Ben took the pen. His hand shook just a little as he wrote his name. Daisy watched him, 4 small, wild faces peering out from behind her, and the faint echo of the eagle's shadow still hanging over them all. The 6 weeks Hank and Maya had written down on that thin white form did not feel like much time when they were still talking in the yard. On paper, it looked generous. 42 days, 6 Saturdays, 6 Sunday dinners with leftovers in the fridge. But once Ben started living inside those days, they seemed to shrink every time he turned around. At first, life didn't look all that different. Maya kept her promise and drove up twice a week, her SUV bumping slowly along the gravel. She brought a scale, a notebook, and sometimes a cooler with things no grocery store in town carried. Frozen quail, rabbit pieces, a few strange-smelling game meats the center used to teach predators how to be predators again. She watched Ridge, Ember, Thorn, and Clover move around the pen, making notes on their balance, their reflexes, the way their eyes tracked motion. "We've got to steer them away from seeing people as their safety net," she explained one afternoon as Daisy paced the fence line and the bobcats tore into a thawed quail. "The more they look to you and Daisy for food, the harder the break will be." Ben nodded, but it was hard to watch. Up until then, he'd measured their days in bottles and bowls, in the way Daisy's tongue smoothed down their fur. Now he watched Ember growl over a strip of meat, watched Ridge drag his prize up the climbing branch Ben had built from an old fence post. Thorn practiced ambushing leaves that blew in through the wire. Clover, smallest of all, still glanced back at Daisy between bites, as if asking permission to like this new, wilder menu. Outside the pen, the rest of life trundled along. Bill still showed up in the mailbox and on his computer screen. Electric, water, that stubborn emergency vet bill that refused to go away. On the nights he couldn't sleep, Ben found himself staring at online banking pages, scrolling past ads for retirement planning and life insurance, thinking how odd it was that the same screen that showed his thinning savings also held videos of his black lab and 4 bobcats making strangers across the country smile for 30 seconds at a time. He tried not to resent the fact that internet fame didn't pay for new fencing, or hay, or dented pickup trucks. Tyler had offered to monetize the video, talking about ad revenue and credit card bonuses like he was explaining the weather. Ben had shaken his head. "This isn't a business," he had said. "It's a mistake we're trying to turn into less of one." The weather held mostly until it didn't. The storm rolled in without much warning on a Wednesday night, one of those quick-moving mountain tempests that seemed to fall out of a clear sky. By late afternoon, the horizon over the ridge had turned the color of old bruises. The wind picked up, pushing dry leaves down the row of apple trees like children racing. Ben checked the forecast on his phone, watching the little radar swirl spin. The local station warned about strong gusts and heavy rain, nothing he hadn't seen before. Still, he felt unease crawl up his spine when the first distant rumble of thunder shook the windows. He stepped out onto the porch. Daisy was already at the edge of the yard, staring toward the pen. Thunder didn't bother her much. What bothered her was anything that came between her and those 4 spotted shapes now streaking around their enclosure, whipped into high spirits by the wind. "Come on, girl," he called. "We'll get 'em settled and batten things down." The air smelled electric as he crossed the yard, the kind of sharp, metallic scent that always made him think of bad news delivered in hospital corridors. Fat drops of rain began to fall, darkening the dust. The tarp he'd replaced after the eagle scare fluttered uneasily. Inside the pen, the bobcats were keyed up, every nerve singing. Ridge leaped from the climbing post to the overturned crate, tail lashing. Ember followed, taking a swat at Thorn as she passed. Clover ping-ponged between Daisy and the wire, unsure whether to play or hide. "Easy," Ben soothed, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to anymore. "Storm'll blow through." He checked the stakes at the corners of the pen, then added 2 more from the shed, driving them into the ground with the heel of his boot. The clouds rolled closer. Thunder cracked overhead, loud enough that he saw Clover flinch and press against Daisy's side. The rain hit hard a few minutes later, a gray wall sweeping across the orchard. Wind tore at the tarp, snapping it like a sail. Ben squinted against the spray, trying to fasten an extra rope over the top. Lightning flickered too close for comfort. "Ben!" Mrs. Cole's voice drifted from her porch next door, thinned by the rain. "You get inside, you hear? Those trees are waving like they're fixing to fall." "Just a minute," he shouted back. He never saw exactly which gust did it. One moment the tarp was fighting and holding. The next, the wind grabbed it like a hand, yanked, and one of the corner grommets gave way. The tarp tore free and slapped against the pen, startling everyone inside. The climbing post, slick with rain, rocked. Ridge, spooked and riding the wild edge of his own nature, took the sudden motion as an invitation. He sprang higher, claws searching for purchase, and grabbed the upper mesh. Another gust shoved the whole contraption sideways. For a terrifying second, the top panel pulled away from its frame, leaving a gap the size of a dinner plate. Thorn was there in an instant, eyes flashing. He lunged for the opening, every instinct screaming run. Daisy hit him like a black wave. She threw her weight against his shoulder, pinning him back into the pen with a strength that came from somewhere deeper than training. Thorn hissed and twisted, not understanding why his world had just slammed into him, but he didn't get through the gap. Ben, heart hammering, grabbed the sagging panel and wrestled it back into place, fingers numb, knuckles scraping metal. Rain ran into his eyes, blurring the world into gray streaks. "Hold still," he begged the storm, the pen, his own aging hands. "Just hold still." Somehow he got the panel secured with a length of spare wire. By the time he stepped back, soaked to the skin, Ridge and Ember had retreated to the back corner, eyes wide, ears flat. Clover was plastered under Daisy's chest again, only the tip of his tail visible. Daisy stood over them all, sides heaving, soaked fur plastered to her ribs. "You all right?" he asked her softly. She shook herself once, sending a spray of water in every direction, then licked Thorn's head, as if to say, "You are not going anywhere, not on my watch." The storm moved on as quickly as it had come. By bedtime, the sky over the ridge was clear again, pricked with stars, the air washed clean. Ben walked the perimeter of the pen in the quiet, fingertips brushing each wire tie, every stake. Maya drove up the next morning, having heard his rattled voicemail. She listened to the whole story, then walked the pen twice, checking his repairs. "They're getting strong," she said, watching Ridge test a new leap with careful eyes. "Too strong for a pen in somebody's backyard. You did well last night, but this is what I meant about the wild not waiting on our schedule." He nodded. The adrenaline had faded, but something else lingered. The memory of Thorn's eyes, bright and hungry for the world beyond the wire. For the first time, he truly saw what Maya had been saying. They were not meant to live under tarps and human worry. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table with Daisy's head in his lap, he glanced at the calendar pinned to the wall. He counted the days again, this time not as a sentence, but as a mercy. 6 weeks had felt short at first. Now, after the eagle and the storm, it felt like exactly how long you were allowed to hold on before you had to prove that love sometimes meant opening your hand. Outside, in the pen, 4 young bobcats slept in a tangled heap, dreaming wild dreams under a sky that belonged to them more than it had ever belonged to him. The last week came in quietly. Like most endings do, there was no grand sign, no fresh storm rolling over the ridge, just a square on the kitchen calendar that had looked distant for so long and now sat under Ben's thumb. Someone had written "transfer" in neat block letters across it. Maya, probably, the day they'd all agreed. He stared at the word over his morning coffee and felt his stomach turn the way it had in the bank that time he'd signed the papers for his mortgage, knowing life would be different on the other side, whether he wanted it to be or not. Outside, the orchard held its breath under a thin layer of frost. Daisy paced the fence line of the pen more than she slept, her black coat dull with worry. Ridge, Ember, Thorn, and Clover were no longer the shaky-legged scraps he'd pulled from that hollow. They moved with purpose now, muscles sliding under spotted fur, eyes bright and sharp. When a squirrel made the mistake of running along the top rail one afternoon, all 4 heads had snapped to attention at once. "They're ready," Maya had said, watching them track the movement, "even if the rest of us aren't." On the morning itself, Ben woke before dawn. He tried to eat, but the toast turned to dust in his mouth. He thought about calling the Wildlife Center to ask for more time, the way you think about calling your health insurance to argue a bill you know you'll end up paying anyway. 6 weeks had become a solid thing in his mind, though, a promise made in front of witnesses. He couldn't bring himself to break it. He went out to the pen in the half-light. The bobcats stirred at the sound of his boots, stretching and blinking. Daisy was already up, sitting squarely in front of the gate like a guard who'd pulled an all-night shift. "Morning," he said, voice rough. "Big day." Maya's SUV arrived first, tires crunching on the driveway. Hank's county truck pulled in behind, the official decal catching the pale light. Mrs. Cole and Tyler came too, walking across from next door in their coats and hats, as if attending a quiet, strange sort of funeral. Maya unloaded 4 hard plastic crates from the back of her vehicle, the kind airlines use to move pets across the country. Seeing them lined up by the barn wall made Ben's throat close. Each one had a metal door and a blanket inside that smelled faintly of wood shavings and disinfectant. "We'll make it as quick as we can," Maya said gently. "Less time to panic that way." They started with Ridge. He was always the first to investigate anything new, boldness written in every line of his body. When Ben set the crate just inside the pen and opened the door, Ridge stalked over, whiskers forward, curiosity beating fear by a nose. A scrap of rabbit meat placed at the back sealed the deal. He stepped in, turned, and the moment his paws hit the blanket, Ben swung the door shut. Ridge's eyes went wide. He threw himself at the metal with a roar that was still half kitten, half promise of what he'd one day become. The crate rocked. Daisy lunged forward, barking, only to be held back by Hank's firm hand on her collar. "It's all right, girl," Hank said, sounding like he wished he believed it completely. Ember took more coaxing. She hung back, tail twitching, ears flat. Maya murmured to her, low and steady, as if explaining a complicated loan document to someone who couldn't read. Finally, Ember darted in after her share of meat, and the door clanged shut behind her. The sound hit Ben harder than he expected. Thorne resisted from the start. He bolted up the climbing post, pressed himself into a corner, every line of him shouting no. Ben climbed into the pen, joints protesting, and spoke to him the way he'd once talked Daisy through thunderstorms. It didn't make much difference. Thorne came down in a whirl of claws and fury, and it was only Maya's practiced hands and a thick towel that kept everyone from bleeding. When his crate door closed, Thorne slammed himself against it until the whole stack rattled. That left Clover. The smallest bobcat stood in the middle of the pen, panting, eyes huge. He didn't look at the crate. He looked at Daisy. When she moved, he shadowed her steps. When she stopped, he pressed against her front leg as if trying to climb inside her skin. Ben's chest ached. "Maybe he stays," he heard himself say, barely aware the words were out. Just him. Just one. Maya's gaze met his. There was a world of sympathy in it, and a wall. "If he stays," she said softly, "he never learns how to be what he is, and one day he'll be big enough that Daisy can't protect him from everything, or from himself." Daisy bent her head and licked Clover between the ears. He leaned into her, sides heaving. Tyler wiped his face with his sleeve. Mrs. Cole turned away, staring hard at the mountains. Ben forced his feet to move. His hands shook as he opened the last crate. "Come on, Clover," he whispered. "Come on, son." Daisy did something then that Ben would remember for the rest of his life. She stepped forward, nudged Clover toward the open door with her nose, and then, very gently, placed a paw on his back as if to steady him. Clover let out a sound caught between a cry and a growl. He dug his claws into the dirt, resisting for a heartbeat, then another. Finally, as if something inside him had decided, he shuffled forward. One paw, then the next, until he was inside. Ben closed the door. The latch clicked. It sounded louder than any thunder he'd ever heard. They carried the crates to the Wildlife Center's truck, loading them in a neat row. Ridge snarled and spat. Ember paced. Thorne threw himself against the sides until the whole vehicle rocked. Clover pressed his face against the bars, eyes fixed on Daisy. When the last latch was secured, Hank stepped back. "We better get moving," he said quietly. "Long road ahead." The engine started. The truck began to roll. Daisy tore free of Ben's grip like he'd never trained her at all. She bolted after the moving vehicle, claws scrambling on the gravel. "Daisy!" Ben shouted, panic cracking his voice. She didn't slow. Her whole body stretched into the run, ears pinned, muscles straining. The truck picked up speed on the slope. For a terrible moment, she was close enough to touch the bumper with her nose. Inside, Clover screamed, a high, breaking sound that cut through the hum of tires and the low growls of his siblings. His paws beat against the crate door, mouth open, calling for a mother who was losing ground with every yard. Ben's boots slipped as he pounded after them down the driveway. The world narrowed to the sound of Daisy's ragged breath, the flash of her black coat against the pale dust, the sight of that truck carrying his foolish decision and his best intentions away. At the edge of the highway, where the gravel met asphalt, Daisy's strength gave out. She stumbled, tried to gather herself, and fell. Her body slid to a halt in a spray of stones, chest heaving, claws digging at the empty air as the truck's red taillights shrank and disappeared around the bend. By the time Ben reached her, his lungs burning, she was lying on her side, tongue lolling, eyes fixed on the place where the truck had gone. "Easy, girl," he gasped, dropping to his knees. "Easy. They're okay. They're just not here." Her sides shuddered under his hand. After a long, shaking moment, she closed her eyes and let her head sink into the dust. The road hummed with distant traffic, the ordinary life of people driving to work, to the grocery store, to banks and appointments and quiet errands. On the shoulder, a black lab who had lost her puppies lay where she'd fallen, and a man who had thought he was done with heartbreak learned there was still room in his chest for one more crack. The days after the truck disappeared around the bend felt longer than the 6 weeks that had come before. Daisy would walk as far as the end of the driveway on her own, then stop and stare down the road as if sheer will might call the truck back. At night, she lay on the porch beside the empty whelping box, nose resting on the rim, the same way she had after losing her own puppies. Now there were 2 sets of ghosts in that box, one she had carried inside her body and one she had carried in her heart. Ben tried to keep her moving. He took her on their old loop through the orchard, then up the trail toward the ridge. At every turn, Daisy paused in the places the bobcats had loved, the stump where Ridge used to pounce on falling leaves, the low branch Clover had once tried to climb and slid off in an undignified heap. She sniffed, listened, then went on, paws dragging a little more each day. At first, updates from Maya came twice a week, then once. She sent short videos to Ben's phone, Ridge and Ember racing along the length of a big outdoor enclosure at the rescue center, muscles coiled, Thorn practicing cautious stalks, through tall grass, Clover hanging back, eyes bright, then joining the chase with a sudden burst of speed. There were charts, too, emailed like bank statements, weights, vaccination dates, notes about their progress. "They're doing well, Ben," Maya wrote. "They're eating what they should, avoiding people like they're supposed to. You did your part. Now we're doing ours." He appreciated the numbers, the careful records, the way it all looked organized and official, like a good health insurance policy or a well-planned retirement account. But at night, when Daisy whimpered in her sleep, what he remembered most were not charts. It was the feel of 4 small bodies pressed against his old jacket, and the way Clover's paws had scrabbled against the crate as the truck pulled away. Time, stubborn as ever, kept moving. Leaves turned, fell, and were replaced by snow along the fence line. Daisy's pacing eased into a quieter kind of waiting. She no longer ran to the end of the road every time an engine sounded, but her ears still twitched at the rumble of distant trucks. One cold afternoon, with a sky the color of tin and a wind that smelled like more snow on the way, Ben found an envelope in his mailbox with the rescue center's logo in the corner. Inside was a letter from Maya, printed on thick paper, and a smaller card. "Dear Ben," it read, "we're holding a volunteer appreciation day next month. I'd like you and Daisy to come, if you're willing. Ridge, Ember, Thorn, and Clover are in our largest pre-release enclosure now. They're nearly ready for the next step. I can't promise they'll remember you or Daisy. In fact, I have to warn you, it's more likely they won't. But I think we all deserve to find out." The date circled on the card looked close and far at the same time, just like that square on his kitchen calendar had. Ben set the letter on the table and watched Daisy nosing through the wood box where he kept her vet records and the old pet insurance forms, as if she knew something with her name on it had just come into the house. "You want to see him again?" he asked quietly. Her tail moved once, a slow sweep across the floor. When the day came, the mountains were bright and hard-edged under a pale winter sun. Ben drove with both hands tight on the wheel, Daisy's head resting between the seats. Mrs. Cole rode in the back, clutching a thermos of coffee. Tyler came too, earbuds forgotten for once. Hank met them at the rescue center gate, his county jacket replaced by a plain flannel shirt like any other man off duty. Maya led them along a gravel path that wound through a stand of pines. "Remember," she said, "this is their world now. We're just visitors. There's a double fence. You and Daisy will stay in the buffer zone. No sudden moves, no calling their names. Let's see what they decide." The pre-release enclosure was huge, several acres of sloping ground dotted with trees and boulders. A high fence circled it, another fence 3 yards out forming the buffer. Inside, the air smelled of pine needles and cold earth. Daisy's nose twitched, taking it all in. For a while, there was nothing, just the whisper of wind and the distant sound of traffic from the highway, soft as a memory. Then a branch moved on the far side of the enclosure, and Ridge appeared. He was bigger now, shoulders thick, spots bold against his coat. Ember slipped out behind him, lower to the ground, eyes scanning. Thorn materialized near a rock pile, cautious as ever. Clover was last, hovering at the tree line, half shadow. They did not rush to the fence. They did not even look at it, not at first. They moved like what they were becoming, wild hunters assessing the shape of their world. Ridge sniffed a stump, leaving his own mark. Ember stalked a drifting leaf with serious intent. Thorn chose a high rock and watched everything from there. Daisy stood very still in the buffer zone, ears forward, tail low. Ben could feel the tension running through her like a wire. He kept his hand on her collar, more for his own comfort than from any fear she'd bolt. Minutes stretched. The Bobcats kept to their business. Maya murmured quietly about their progress, about how this was exactly what you wanted to see before release. Tyler shifted from foot to foot, disappointment creeping onto his face. Mrs. Cole dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her scarf. Hank stared at the ground, jaw tight. "Well," Maya said gently at last, "this might be all we get. And that's all right. It means they're where they're supposed to be." Ben swallowed against the lump in his throat. He looked at Daisy. She was still watching the cats, but there was something new in her posture now, a kind of sag, as if a door inside her had begun to close. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "We've seen they're safe. That's what matters." He took a step back, and the movement tugged Daisy's collar just enough to pull a small sound from deep in her chest. It was a noise he hadn't heard since before her own puppies died. A low, wavering whine she used to make at the end of the day, standing over a box full of sleeping pups, saying in her own way, "Are you all here? Are you all right?" The sound carried across the buffer zone, through the inner fence, and into the trees. Ridge froze. His head snapped up. Ember stopped mid-step. Thorn turned on his rock, ears pricked. Somewhere at the edge of the pines, Clover lifted his face as if a scent had hit him like a wave. Then, as one, all 4 bobcats turned toward the fence. Then, as one, all 4 bobcats turned toward the fence. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Ridge stood poised, muscles bunched, eyes fixed on the strip of ground between the pines and the wire. Ember's ears were forward, her tail low. Thorn dropped from his rock, paws landing without a sound. Clover took one uncertain step, then another. Daisy made that sound again, the old mother's whine that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with love. Her body trembled under Ben's hand. Ridge moved first. He broke into a run that swallowed the distance in a handful of strides, a wild, flowing motion that made Ben's breath catch. Ember followed, then Thorn, and finally Clover, suddenly all in, racing after his siblings. They didn't slow until they hit the inner fence. Ridge jumped halfway up, claws hooking into the mesh. Ember reared on her hind legs, pressing her face to the wire. Thorn paced back and forth along the barrier, eyes never leaving Daisy. Clover skidded to a stop and shoved his nose through the lowest gap he could find, mouth opening in a hoarse cry that was not quite a kitten's mew and not yet a grown bobcat's scream, but something in between that held every long, lonely mile between the orchard and this pine stand. Daisy surged forward as far as the outer fence would let her, tail low and swaying, ears pinned with emotion. Her paws dug into the gravel. Ben kept his hand on her collar, but there was no pulling in her body now, no urge to chase a truck. She only wanted to get as close as the world would allow. "Oh, my," Mrs. Cole whispered behind him. "Oh, my Lord." Ridge pressed his forehead to the wire, whiskers quivering. Daisy met him there, touching her nose to the metal. Ember rubbed her cheek along the fence, leaving her scent like a child, pressing her face into a familiar coat. Thorn, always cautious, circled once, then twice, before finally leaning his weight against the mesh, letting his shoulder rest where Daisy's breath warmed the air. Clover lay down right at the edge, paws poked through as far as they could go. Daisy lowered herself slowly, carefully, until her chest met the gravel opposite his. She slid one paw up to meet his, claws sheathed, pads touching metal. For a moment the two of them were still as a photograph, black fur and spotted fur separated by wire, and a dozen necessary decisions, joined by something that didn't care about distance or law or anyone's careful plans. Maya's hand had gone to her throat. Hank stared openly now, all the practiced official distance wiped off his face. Tyler's phone sagged forgotten at his side. Whatever video might have been made of that moment would never have matched the way it felt. "They remember," Tyler said softly. "They really remember." Maya nodded without taking her eyes off the fence. "Of course they do," she said. "Brains big enough to hunt, big enough to remember who held them when they were small." They stayed like that for a long time, longer than anyone had planned. No one rushed them. For once there were no forms to sign, no talks of liability or pet insurance or home insurance or any of the other adult worries that usually rode along on days like this. There was only breathing and the quiet rasp of fur against wire. Eventually the bobcats began to drift, back into their world. Ridge was the first to go, torn between two duties: check on his territory or stay pressed against the fence. He dropped lightly to the ground and trotted a short distance away, pausing to glance back once before vanishing into the brush. Ember followed, gliding along the fence line until a shifting shadow caught her interest. Thorn lingered longest, as if vetting the air one last time before slipping around a boulder and out of sight. Clover held on. His paws stayed through the mesh, pads resting where Daisy's tongue could just barely graze them. At last he lifted his head and stared at her, those pale eyes older now, but clear. Daisy answered with a low chuff, the sound she'd used 100 times to call them in from play. Clover blinked slowly, then pulled his paws back. He gave the fence a final nudge with his nose, turned, and padded into the trees. The undergrowth swallowed his spots. The wire hummed once under Daisy's breath, then stood still. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt full, like a church after a hymn. "That," Maya said quietly, "is more than most people ever get." On the drive home, Daisy didn't stare at the road. She watched the hills instead, nose lifted to the cracked window, catching every scent the winter air had to offer. Ben drove with one hand resting on her back. Something in him had eased, the tight knot he'd been carrying since the day he'd lifted 4 half-frozen bodies out of a rock hollow. Life, being indifferent to drama, went on. The rescue center scheduled the Bobcats' release for early spring, when the snowmelt fed the streams and prey was plentiful. There were meetings and plans, maps printed, and permits filed. Maya invited Ben and Daisy to come along, but only to watch from the perimeter. This part was, as she put it gently, not about us anymore. On the morning of the release, a handful of staff gathered at a gate deep in the mountains, far from any highway. The sky was clear, the ground soft with old pine needles. Ben stood with Daisy at his side, feeling the cool damp seep through his boots. One by one, the crate doors opened. Ridge shot out like an arrow, disappearing into the underbrush without a backward glance. Ember followed with a lower, more cautious run, her body hugging the ground as she ghosted between trunks. Thorn took 3 careful steps, tasted the air, and then melted into the rocks like he'd always belonged there. Clover was last. He stepped into the open, pausing just long enough for Ben to see him clearly. Bigger now, sleek and strong. He lifted his nose, scented the wind, and for a moment his head turned in their direction. Whether he saw Daisy or only caught a shred of familiar smell on the breeze, no one could say. Then he too was gone, the forest closing behind him. The tracking collars they wore would send signals, little dots on a screen that the rescue staff could pull up in an office somewhere, like a kind of wild online banking, deposits and withdrawals of movement and survival instead of dollars. Every so often Maya would email a screenshot to Ben, a cluster of points spreading out along the ridges, mapping the new lives his porch had helped begin. At the orchard, seasons circled around again. The apples bloomed and set and were picked. Daisy aged, muzzle frosting, joints stiffening the way Ben's had years before. She no longer ran the length of the fence, but she still walked it, pausing at the corners where bobcat paws had once worn faint paths. Maya started bringing other broken creatures up the hill, injured owls, nervous fawns, a fox with a mangled leg. Daisy, with her gentle eyes and old soul, turned out to be good medicine. She lay quietly nearby while Maya changed bandages or checked wounds, her calm presence doing what no pill or fancy health insurance policy could promise, making fear ease enough for healing to begin. Hank came by sometimes without a badge, just a man with coffee and stories about stray dogs and found turtles. Mrs. Cole baked pies and claimed she was only using up apples. Tyler, taller now, helped Ben with the heavier work, his phone full of newer videos, but still keeping that one of Daisy and the Bobcats tucked away like a favorite song. Every so often, when the mail brought something worrying, a medical bill, a notice about rising mortgage rates, a reminder that nothing in this world stayed cheap or easy, Ben would sit on the porch steps with Daisy's head in his lap and look out at the line of mountains. Somewhere up there, 4 wild hearts were hunting and sleeping and raising whatever life handed them. Family, he said once, half to Daisy and half to the hills, isn't always who stays under your roof. Sometimes it's who passes through and leaves you better than they found you. Daisy thumped her tail in agreement, eyes half closed. A breeze came down off the ridge, carrying with it the faint, wild smell of pine and rock and something else he couldn't quite name. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he caught the memory of warm spots and milk-sour fur and a tiny, rusty hiss that had once told him, "You're not my mother," right before the world proved otherwise. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows from the apple trees. The old farmhouse, with its creaky floors and its stacks of ordinary paperwork, bills, vet records, that long paid-off mortgage, glowed soft in the light. On the porch of that house, a grieving dog who had lost her puppies and the man who had thought his heart was done breaking sat together and watched the mountains their wild children now called home. And for the first time in a long time, the future, with all its unknowns, didn't feel quite so empty. It felt, in its own rough-edged way, full. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.